The second thing he decided he could do was that if once the people understood the gospel of Jesus Christ, that this statement in 2 Corinthians could be fulfilled. In 2 Corinthians 17:3, it says something like this, 3 and 17, I'm sorry, that where the Spirit of Christ is also freedom. In other words, if the people were true Christians, they would understand and fight for freedom. Well, the king was upset with John, and he did everything in his power to destroy him, but he couldn't. Needless to say, John published an edition of the New Testament. He died, and then another man stepped into his shoes, an incredible individual, a man who risked his life to continue what John had started. His name was Tyndale, William Tyndale. What he did, he took John Wycliffe's writings and cleaned them up a little bit and published the Bible. He published the New Testament first. At that time, the king was so upset he wanted his church, and he threatened anybody that would do that, anybody to take a position contrary to the Church of England, they would be destroyed. For some 15 years, he tried to kill Tyndale. In fact, he had all kinds of people tracking him down, trying to get him to come back to England. He lived in Holland. After many years in Holland, Tyndale was able to publish a New Testament. And the way he got it back into England, they shipped a lot of sheep furs or hides back to England, and he would hide these New Testaments in those sheep hides and send them to England. The king was not able to find out how he was doing it. So he put a man in charge of stopping Tyndale, whose goals were exactly the same thing as Wycliffe. I can get the gospel in the hands of people, they will repent, we can have freedom that we need, and we'll be better people. Well, the king figured out he could finally beat Tyndale. He found out the sources where people went to buy the books. And so the king authorized his agents to go out and buy every one of the books. As quick as they came out, he'd go buy them. What he didn't know, that was part of Tyndale's plan. Tyndale felt the need to republish the New Testament. There were some mistakes in it, and he wanted to clean it up. So he upped the price of the books. The king paid it, and he paid for a new edition of the New Testament, which later distributed throughout the United Kingdom. After that, they finally trapped Tyndale and burned him at the stake. Again, he risked his life in order that we could enjoy the freedoms we enjoy now. That was one of those important steps, like building the airplane, it would be like the research engineers we hired. Another important step is the story of Gutenberg. I don't know if you know it or not, but the creation of the Gutenberg press was absolutely a miracle and an accident at the same time. He had a sweetheart, and he didn't have much money to buy her a gift. He was an excellent carver, so he decided what he would do. He would carve her something really nice and give it to her. So one of the woods they used to carve at that time was a willow. So he went to a large willow tree, carved a little block with her initials on it, wrapped it up in a piece of tissue paper he had, and took it to her house and gave it to her. When he unwrapped it and handed it to her, he noticed something very strange, that where those little blocks had been wrapped, they left an indentation with her initials on it. That started thinking about creating the press. The process they used at that time was all about love, and he was a good Christian. Then we go on with the Pilgrims. Now you know the story of the Pilgrims. Let me tell you the rest of the story you may not know. Remember in 1607 they were called separatists. The separatists were being chased about by the king again. They went to Holland. After 10 or 15 years they got discouraged because their children were picking up the traditions of the people in Holland. They didn't like that, so they decided to go back to England and from there to America. In order to get to America, they had to have someone support them. So there was the company men. In other words, people who had the money to finance them. They financed the Pilgrims. They went to Americas. They had, that is, the company men had the rights to some land in Virginia. As the Lord would have it, they were blown off route to the extent they were blown clear up into New England, in the Boston area. When they arrived in Boston, they came around, and now we're in 10th of November, 11th of November time period. They parked the ship, and before the Pilgrims would get off that ship, they decided they had to write some charter. They wrote the Mayflower Compact, which was the first document of government in the United States, written by firm believers in Jesus Christ and in Christianity. After they had written the document and they all signed it, then a group of them went out looking for some place where they could build a little town where they could live. After several days, they were curious. They had seen some Indians once or twice, but they couldn't find the Indians they'd heard about. When Columbus came to America in 1492, he had created and discovered the freeway to America, which everybody used thereafter. That was one of his major accomplishments. The fishermen discovered this and were soon fishing off the Grand Banks. And they had tried to land in that area and then quickly discovered some Indians that were not the friendliest people in town. And so that became a place to stay away from. Well, when the Pilgrims landed, there were no Indians to be found. But they did find approximately 20 acres of land that had been tilled and looked like it had been prepared for somebody to move there. They also found 3 deposits of corn that were in, one was in a big metal kettle, another had been buried under the ground. They didn't have any idea where that came from. They also found 3 freshwater springs. They thought these were miracles, as indeed they were. Later they found out through an Indian, Slamset, who came there. He had been taken prisoner by the English fishermen, taken back to England. He'd lived with them for 7 years. Can you hear me back there?
Yes.
Are you okay? Okay. So anyway, when he walked into their little village, he said, "Hi, how are you?" And the Pilgrims about passed out. Here was an Indian, dressed like an Indian, speaking almost perfect English. They couldn't understand it. To them, it was another miracle, which indeed it was. He taught them the essentials of living in the land they were living in. Taught them about corn, seeds, fishing, etc., etc. It was through him that got them through the winter. Now, very quickly, the true story of Thanksgiving is not what you've been taught. Let me tell you the true story. In 1620, they arrived. 1621 was a difficult year for the Pilgrims, very difficult. They barely got through the year. 1621 turned into 1622. Around early spring, they had to make a decision. Bradford, first thing they built was a large building in which they housed their inventory, their foods. They also used it as a chapel, and sometimes people even lived there. The decision they had to make was whether or not they plant all the corn, the seeds they had, or eat them. If they planted them all, then they'd have to find something else to use. Well, the decision was made they would plant the seeds and risk it and trust in God. They planted in April and May. By June, they had a beautiful crop. The corn was up and about so high, and squash and the other things were doing well. They found a lot of fish in the streams. There were some berries still to be found. There was wild game, turkeys and whatnot. And there was adequate lobsters, crab and whatnot. Matter of fact, how would you like to live in this environment? Lobster was so plentiful that only the poor ate it. The rich didn't like it. So anyway, come July, something strange happened. They didn't have any rain, stopped raining, the fish in the streams just disappeared, the game disappeared, there was nothing to be found on the ocean. They didn't know what to do. Bradford and the rest of them were very, very, very concerned. One night, we're now into August, late part of August, 1st September, he goes down and he had a place he liked to go sit and pray and think nice thoughts. This night he thought, well, you know, if something doesn't happen, if we don't get rain, we're going to starve to death. And so he was sitting on the rock praying when an idea came to his mind. I call it inspiration. What they needed to do was not only pray, but fast and pray. So he rushed back, woke up the minister and said, "Why did you suggest us? We need to fast and pray." And he said, "Well, if I suggested it, you wouldn't have done it." So I asked him, since he was a leader, he woke everybody up and called a meeting at 6 o'clock in the warehouse. So at that time, the majority were still the workers from the company. In other words, the company men. So he said, "Look, we've tried everything. We're going to starve to death unless we do something, and we do it now. What I suggest is we start this morning and we fast and pray all day, and perhaps then we can get rain. Well, there were some objections. The company men said, we don't believe in God, we're not going to do that. And so finally he said, look, we'll make a deal. You give me a better idea and we'll do it. Well, they didn't have a better idea, so they finally acquiesced and they agreed to fast and pray, which they did.